Greetings and salutations, friends. So, Orcs and Goblins tactics. Now, I'm not going to be promising that I'm going to do a tactics video for every single faction. One, because I don't really have a way of visualizing what I'd like to get across. For some factions I could use the Kingdoms mod, Rage of Dark Gods, but even in the mod, many of the armies don't really behave the way you might expect them to on the tabletop, so I'm going to be optimistic here and kinda just hope that the new Creative Assembly team manages to get the armies closer to their tabletop counterparts. Of course, some concessions and some compromises will inevitably have to be done, but for the moment, I'm just going to be extremely optimistic while I'm making the tactics video, so I'm probably only going to make them for factions that play either extremely uniquely or very differently than what you might expect. So you'll just have to bear with the lack of visualization for now. Once the game is out, I might redo all of the tactic videos for whatever factions are available to give you a bit better of an understanding of them, but for the moment, I'm going to do this relatively simple. I'm just going to attempt to give you a basic understanding of how the armies might work. Now, why am I doing orcs, you might question then? If you're going to do armies that fight either in a very strange way or very differently than what they actually might appear to, why orcs? Well, because orcs, in fact, do not fight at all like you might imagine that orcs do. Now, in Warhammer fluff, Orcs and Goblins are a horde army. They just charge straight ahead, and this is the reason why they usually get beat. You see, Orcs and Goblins are not particularly good fighters in Warhammer fluff terms, and I'm not meaning as in hand-to-hand, one-on-one fighting here, I'm talking as in armies. They usually get their asses royally trunched by anyone and everyone, basically because most of Orcish generals can't really lead, or they have no interest in leading. They just want to get stuck in with the boys, so to say. Of course, if you are an Orcish general, you're different. You're a smart Orcish general, the only Orcish generals that actually win battles. So, how is the Orcs and Goblins army different? Well, it's less of a charging army and more of a counter-charging army, because it's not a very fast army. Even your cavalry isn't that fast. They make up for it in sheer impact, but again, if you get caught, well, most of your impact is just going to go away. Your Savage Orc Boar Boys might actually be able to take on that unit of Empire Knights, but if they get to charge you first with their lances, then you're probably in some pretty deep shit. So how do you actually get around that? How does the Orc army actually function? Well, it functions somewhat along the same lines as the Skaven, using meat shields to prepare the way for your proper troops. However, whereas the Skaven simply just fill the space in front of them with expendable Skaven slaves and use them as a way to wear down, slow down, and reposition the enemy, the Orcs do not have access to units that are quite as expendable as the Skaven slaves. You of course have access to Goblins, but you're not going to be having as many of them, and Goblins have one severe drawback. You see, while Skaven are motivated just by the simple thought that there are more Skaven behind them, which can make them surprisingly hard to break, the Goblins have no such special rule. The Goblins have to rely on their basic leadership or the leadership of their general if he's nearby. Which means that a unit of Goblins is actually a fair bit easier to break than Skaven slaves. Additionally, while Orcs are nice, big, tough and strong bastards, they have essentially no concept of teamwork or squad-based tactics. And as such, they are going to be beaten by weaker humans, simply because a unit of Empire Spearmen have the advantage of formation. So, again, how do you actually get around some of this? Well, first and foremost, perhaps the most surprising element is the fact that a successful Orc and Goblins army contains a fairly large amount of artillery. In total war terms, you probably want 3 or 4 units of artillery, giving you at least 8 units, individual models I mean, to play with. And with the Orcs and Goblins army being how it is, you should probably have a unit of Doom Divers to be used as a sniping unit. They're essentially there to use their high accuracy to take care of really big threats, like that evil-looking demon prince that is about to rampage through your lines, or that massive unit of high elf dragon knights, or blood dragon vampires, etc. Stuff that you really can't afford to hit you dead on. Then you've got a couple unit of rock lobbers making up for about 8 catapults. This is just for general damage inflictation, where you target whatever enemy infantry is barreling at you straight on to try and soften them up a bit, and even the odds for your orcs, as every single enemy unit killed by the artillery is one less unit that you need to kill before the unit starts wavering and eventually breaking. And then, if you're frisky, I'd say you should probably pop in a couple of units of Goblin Spear Chuckers, simply to increase the amount of stuff you can throw at the enemy army. Add to that 2 or 3 units of your basic Orcish archers, again, essentially just to have something to throw at the enemy. They are essential for actually taking care of enemy skirmishers, so that they can't sit behind their battle lines once they are established in melee and start hurling javelins over your head, and for taking out enemy archers, crossbowmen, etc., things that are lurking behind the battle lines. And you really cannot afford them to hang around, because you need to be able to maneuver in that space. And here's why. While you do use units of goblins essentially to soak up the charge of enemy units, to slow it down a bit and allow your orcs to actually get in there on their own terms rather than getting charged, even though your orcs are quite excellent brawling units, and things like Black Orcs and Savage Orcs in particular are quite capable of inflicting severe damage on pretty much anything they're going to be facing, you're not actually guaranteed to win. Especially considering that right now we're just taking a normal Empire army as an example. Humans, in other words. What if you're fighting Chaos Warriors? What if you're fighting Ogres? What if you're fighting other Orcs? You simply just can't rely on always winning the melee just in a stand-up fight. And this is where many of the more interesting Orc and Goblins units come into their own. For example, the humble Goblin Wolf Rider. Now, on its surface, the unit might not seem like much, and, well, it isn't much. However, remember the simple fact that your orcs are pretty damn tough, and can usually stick it out in melee for considerably longer than most enemies can, and even if they're not going to be winning the melee, they can probably slow the enemy down for a considerable amount of time. And this is where your Goblin Wolf Riders comes in, because by this point your artillery and your magic has been severely reducing the number of enemy cavalry. And so, while the enemy's front lines are bogged down in your infantry, you can use the Orc Ball Boys to smash apart whatever cavalry remains, and then follow up with Goblin Wolf Riders to hunt down their artillery crew and see off any archers or skirmishers they may have around, and then turn on the main battle using projectile weapons, javelins, or if you've given them bows for example, to start whittling away at the enemy's rear where they're less protected, and then of course starting to charge in, retreat, charge in, retreat, etc. Now, this is of course in an ideal world where you've actually been able to see off the enemy cavalry. And while you should most certainly make that a priority, because like I said, the Orc and Goblin army needs room to maneuver to get into the flanks and rear of the enemy to guarantee victory, there are some workarounds. For example, the Orc army can be played more along the lines of a sledgehammer force. It's riskier, but it's more orky. What you essentially need to do this is a couple big, nice, solid blocks of solid melee brawling infantry. Think Black Orcs, etc. With a couple units of sledgehammer units, think Savage Orcs, maybe a unit of boar boys for a little bit extra pump, and perhaps some chariots. Essentially what you need is something that hits really, really hard on the charge, and then you need the centerline stone of your giant green fist. Usually this central stone is made up of a solid unit of trolls. And the idea here is to have the trolls move up first, soaking up most of the incoming ranged damage, while you're using your artillery to force the enemy to enter skirmish formation, thereby lessening the amount of stuff they can actually throw at you. So the trolls will eat most of the ranged damage. They will take on the worst of the charge, because they can handle it. They've got regeneration, they're tough little bastards. They'll probably soldier on through. On each flank of the trolls, you have your Black Orcs. They are essentially there to support your trolls. They're not part of the hammer blow per se, they're there to make sure your hammer doesn't break on first impact, which it might do. A unit of trolls is powerful, yes, but if it gets hit by several units of elite heavy infantry, think chaos or ogres, they have the potential to melt really damn fast, which is why you need the Black Orcs in there to strengthen your line. Now that you've stabilized, this is where the hammer comes in. A couple nice big fat units of savage orc biggins, supported perhaps with some orc boar boys, will now slam into each side of your main stone and attempt to rout the enemy. What you're essentially trying to do here is lure the enemy onto your rock and then hit them with the hammer from each flank. Again, you're not actually charging the enemy so much as you are letting the enemy engage you, and therefore allowing you to get the counter charge in on them without opening up your lightly armored units to a charge or extended periods of ranged. Now, this is a quite risky strategy though, because you're pretty much relying on your savage orcs to inflict a whole lot of damage here and actually try and break your enemy, as your second wave, so to say, is probably going to be consisting of your average run-of-the-mill orcs, which are quite lacking in the sheer smashing department, especially compared to Chaos Warriors or Ogres. Now, against something along the lines of an Empire army, the strategy will work quite fine, presuming, of course, that the Empire General is stupid enough to bash himself upon your rock. If he simply hangs back and lets his line bend under your initial rock, now you're going to have to charge your savage orcs into lines of spear again. Not great. So, like I said, a little bit risky. Much better to have the enemy come to you. And again, that's why we have a ton of artillery. You want to try and always have artillery advantage, simply so that the enemy will always fight on your terms, rather than you having to charge into his solid prepared spear line. A good Empire or High Elf general loves nothing more than to see a disorganized mob of orcs charge directly at his heavily defended and well-prepared lines, with rank upon rank of reinforcements standing behind it to tighten up any gaps that might occur. Of course, there are a couple different ways you could actually play the Orcs and Goblin army that would allow you a little bit more flexibility. For example, you could go much more of a Skaven-y route, because you could play Night Goblins. Now, Night Goblins are essentially just normal goblins, except a little bit more batshit insane, and they have some special units. And they are more or less a army unto themselves. However, they play very differently, because there are there are essentially no orcs in a Night Goblin army. Which means that again, now you're relying on sheer numbers and on squigs and some special weapons to inflict the vast majority of your damage. Again, since you have access to a lot more indirect fire artillery than the Skaven, you can afford to hang back and just simply overwhelm the enemy with numbers. Pound him with artillery as he gets close, unleash some nice solid units of squigs on him to break up his formation, and then just start grinding him down with wave upon wave of Night Goblins, holding down his fronts and surrounding him in a battle of attrition that only you have the numbers to win. Alternatively, you can play the Orcs and Goblins as an extremely elite list, which is what I kind of suggested in my army video. If you allow big guns to be recruitable, and you allow black orcs to at least be relatively prevalent, so that if you have a black orc general, you can have 6 units of them, you can craft yourself a very, very elite army that can actually take on most other armies in just a straight-up melee fight. Now, I'd still be a little bit careful about taking on Chaos or Ogres in a straight-up bloody fight. You should probably have a trick or two up your sleeve before you start a grinding war with Chaos, but it's certainly a lot more feasible than a more standard Orcs and Goblins army. Additionally, you do have access to some fairly potent magic in the form of a big warg, having some pretty damn nice templates. The orc magic is pretty damn good for smashing apart large units of enemy infantry. However, it is orc magic, which means you're going to be miscasting, and you're going to be miscasting quite a lot. And depending on how miscasts will actually work, well, it could be disastrous, could be nothing. The third and final way you could play an Orcs and Goblins army is in a much more annoying mobile way, where you essentially try to have all of your units mounted. Tons of boar boys, tons of chariots, tons of wolf riders, tons of spider riders. But you're still going to need a little bit of artillery, in this case particularly doom divers, because if the enemy's got some big badass, like a bloodthirster, great demon or something along those lines, you need to be able to take care of him before you really start engaging in melee, because if this guy starts wading through your goblin wolf riders, you're going to be losing really damn quickly. And in this case, it would really be all about hit and run. You need to be picking away at the enemy at every chance and repeatedly charging him at the flanks and rear and attempting to never actually get into a straight-up fight. Which could be hard, especially depending on what army you're facing, as quite a few armies have light cavalry capable of not only catching your goblin wolf riders, but also beating the absolute snot out of them. So, as I hope you've learned now, the Orcs and Goblin army is a lot more finesse than you might actually think it is, requiring a bit more work from its general than you might consider. But at the same time, it is a very rewarding army to actually get right, because you have quite a lot of freedom, and you do have to work a little bit more for your victories than you might think. Now, I'm not saying that Chaos is an easier faction, although in many cases they are, if you're allowed to engage in a protracted melee, and Ogres are most definitively not easier, simply because while your Ogres are damn good melee fighters, there are very, very few of them, and so every single Ogre you lose is going to impact you quite severely. But with Orcs, you really always have to have something up your sleeve, some strategy, some finesse to your battle plan, as simply charging the enemy might get you through the battle as Chaos, and it might get you through the battle as Ogres. For Orcs and Goblins, a flat-out charge, as fluff-correct as it may be, is almost a guaranteed death sentence. So just remember, tons of artillery, tons of boys, and a sneaky plan, and you'll do just fine as an Orc Warboss. So, that's pretty much my ideas on this one. I haven't played that much Orcs and Goblins, to be honest, so I can't give you that much more of an in-depth analysis, at least not until I actually know how they're going to be working in-game, after which I might be able to work something up, but for the moment, I've been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Have a good day.